All right. Good morning, everybody. Um, I want to start with a couple things today. One, to help you review for the test, and then one, kind of a plea I have to those of you who are watching this video right now. Um, I am very, very concerned about this year's students taking this test. I get analytics on these YouTube videos just to see number of people who are watching them. And the YouTube video, here we are 2 days after I posted the YouTube video that goes over the rubric for the first extended response. A rubric which, as you recall, for those of you who watched it, if you don't get the thesis point, you can't get the majority of the points on the question, meaning you can't pass the question. That video has been watched by 14 people out of the 56 who say that they're taking this test. So for those of you who are actually watching this video, I'm just going to put out a plea to you to please reach out to your friends and tell them that they need to at least watch the videos related to those things related to the extended response rubrics, because it is very concerning to me the number of people who are not preparing for this test, given that your test is right now in 4 days. I understand very much that these situations are challenging, and that this is not the ideal situation, but my seniors who I expected to be completely checked out at this point are watching their videos and doing all the things that they need to do to review, and it's the juniors who are doing very little. So this is kind of the opposite of what I normally see, is that the seniors usually check out when we get to May, and that's not happening this year. The juniors who usually work really hard in May, for whatever reason, this class is not doing that as a whole. So for those of you, those 11 or 14 or 16 who watch these videos, thank you. You're doing what you need to do to pass this test. If you could please reach out to your friends who are in this class and please encourage them to do the same, I would appreciate that, because I'm very concerned. I'm going to send out an email today about that, but I want to kind of make a plea out there to people. You got 4 days, so if this is not the time to say, oh, I'll worry about it later, that's not going to happen. So you're getting close. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over Unit 2 review. I also want to thank Simran. She put together a review sheet. If you go out to my website under AP Review Assignments, Simran put together a study guide that basically takes my foundational document summary and then about 12 pages just of definitions and things that she looked up online, cases. She pulled all of this off YouTube, or not YouTube, but off of Google, and just searching things on the internet about various units. So there's very kind of bare bones summary on a lot of the stuff, but if you're taking the test and you are forgetting what something means, that you might be able to kind of draw back to that. So there might be something you might want to take a look at. Maybe print out a couple pages of it or all of it just to have there with you when you take the test. So that's out on my website here under AP Review Assignments. Now, today we're going to look at Unit 2. Now, I will tell you right now, there is no way that I can go over Unit 2, which is the branches of government, in any realistic sense and not have this video be 2 hours long. So I'm going to kind of cover the bare bones, just summary of these chapters. These are essentially chapters 13 through 16 in your binder. It is everything in tab 2. It is the congressional chapter, the president, the bureaucracy, and the judicial branch. So it's not really much with cases in this chapter. That's mainly civil rights and civil liberties, which is Unit 3, which we'll do tomorrow. But it's really the structure of how the courts work, all of those terms that you may have forgotten, amicus briefs, things like that. So we'll take a look at that stuff today, just kind of an overview of that. Please go back and look through the PowerPoints that I have for chapters 13 through 16. All of those are out on my website. Review the vocabulary terms. That is going to be very, very important to make sure that you are getting that information, what you need for this unit. Now, on a normal year, this unit, as you can see here, is anywhere between a quarter and a third of the test. This year, with them shortening the test, I'm guaranteeing that at least one of your 2 extended responses is about the structure of the branches of government. It is guaranteed to be, essentially, given how they normally structure this test. So be prepared for that. So you need to make sure you know the powers that each branch of government has, the checks that each of the branches has over the other branches. All of that is going to be critical to making sure that you're prepared for this section of the test. Okay, now in this unit, there's a lot here. Okay, so basically almost 14, I think it's 14 sections here with the, or 15 sections with the bureaucracy in here. So I'm just going to kind of go over this stuff in a little bit of detail, not a ton of detail, because I'm only going to have this video be about 35, 40 minutes. But I want to make sure that you have what you need for the test. So let's start with topic 2.1, and this is Congress. So when we look at Congress, you need to make sure that you know how the House of Representatives is different from the Senate. So when we look at the different structures, powers, and functions of Congress, the Senate obviously is designed to represent the states equally. I'm up here under essential knowledge, while the House is designed to represent by population. The House was always intended to be the group that is the closest to the people. So the House, your representative is from Dayton. Our two U.S. senators are not from Dayton. So you're going to expect that your House of Representatives member is going to know your community better than your senator will, just because he's more likely to be from that area, he or she. Now, the different chamber sizes, you obviously need to know the size. There's 100 people in the U.S. Senate. There's 435 in the House. And that really impacts debate within those bodies. So if you remember, the House has timed debate in which they set in the Rules Committee how long bills will be debated, and they do that for a reason. If they let all 435 people talk for as long as they want, like they do in the Senate, no bills would ever get passed because they'd be there forever. So the Senate, because there's only 100 people, is a lot more manageable in terms of debate. The House is much harder to organize, which is why the Rules Committee will oftentimes limit debate on bills to a certain period of time. So the chamber sizes impact the debate there. Coalitions are affected by term length differences. One of the things we see is that the House members obviously serve for 2 years. They're constantly running for re-election. You're in there, you learn your job for 6 months, you do your job for a year, and then you got to go run for re-election for 6 months. So that's the hard part that Congress is going to face dealing with the coronavirus issue right now, is that we're now in May, and the election's in November. So now we're 6 months away from the election, and members of the House of Representatives want to go back home and campaign. Now, obviously, campaigning is going to look a little bit different now than it normally does, but there's differences there. The Senate, obviously, with the longer term lengths, have more time to actually govern. So given the 6-year terms, you have a lot more time to actually be there and actually govern. Talks in this A4 here section about enumerated and implied powers in the Constitution allow for the creation of public policy by Congress. So when we talk about enumerated powers, those are powers that are specifically laid out by the Constitution that, whether it be Congress has or the president may have or whatever the case may be, but enumerated powers are specifically listed in the Constitution. Implied powers are powers that we believe that Congress has. And we kind of talked about this as it related to necessary and proper clause with McCulloch versus Maryland, is that we know that Congress can charter a bank, not listed in the Constitution, but it's implied through other things that are listed in the Constitution. So obviously enumerated powers, Congress has to pass the federal budget. They're responsible for raising taxes, coining money, formally declaring war, enacting legislation that addresses all sorts of views. So again, talking about Congress, the Constitution itself is the required document that you want to point to there. Obviously, Article 1, dealing with the structure of Congress, is critical. You need to make sure what's in Article 1, as well as the powers of Congress. Refer back to my Chapter 13 PowerPoint if you forget any of those. Section 2.2 talks about structures, powers, and functions of Congress. You need to explain how the structure, powers, and functions of both houses affect the policy-making process. So it says here, by design, the different structures, powers, and functions of the House and Senate affect the policy-making process. Now, we know the Senate can filibuster. The House cannot filibuster. The House has their Rules Committee, which sets the terms of debate. The Senate does not have any of that. The leadership positions are different. Each chamber has a majority leader. The majority leader in the Senate is actually in control, whereas in the House, the majority leader is kind of secondary to the Speaker of the House, who has the majority of the power there. So the structure of the chambers are different. It says in B2, though both chambers rely on committees to conduct hearings and debate bills, different constitutional responsibilities of the House and Senate affect the policymaking process. Now remember, the House of Representatives is responsible for any bill that raises revenue. So that's a bill that's going to go through what's called the House Ways and Means Committee. All of those bills start there. They're responsible for anything related to tax revenue. The Senate has the power of approving presidential appointments, whether that be to the U.S. Supreme Court, whether that be ambassadors, things like that. So while there are powers, particularly as it comes to making laws, that both chambers have to pass a bill, there are other things that are specific to one branch of Congress. So on those things, such as bills that raise revenue, you would need to specifically say that the House has this power and not Congress. So that's the difference between scores on an AP test, whether it be a 3 or a 4 or a 2 or a 3 or whatever, is that if you say that Congress has a power that only belongs to one House of Congress, that would be something that could ding you a little bit there. Talks down here, chamber-specific procedures, rules, and roles that impact the policymaking process. Obviously, the number of chamber and debate rules that set the bar high for building majority support. If you're in the House of Representatives, you got a lot of people in the House, so it's really hard to get those coalitions together. That's where you kind of rely on the whip, the party whip, to kind of line up the votes that you have within a chamber. Filibuster and cloture. Cloture is obviously the number of votes you need to break a filibuster. That is 60. So as long as you have, if you can get 60 votes, you can stop a filibuster. Otherwise, they can talk forever. Roles of Rules Committee, obviously, role of Committee of the Whole, discharge petitions. Remember discharge petitions? That's a key piece here. If a bill is stuck in committee and you can't get it out, you want to get that bill to go to the floor, and that bill happens to get hung up in committee. You can ask for a discharge petition. So a discharge petition, if that is asked for, then Congress as a whole would vote on whether that piece of legislation would come out of committee immediately and go to the floor for a vote, and then they would vote on it. So it's basically a two-step process for voting on an issue. It also talks about the Committee of the Whole. Committee of the Whole we didn't really talk about in class, but that's basically a kind of a meeting of pretty much all members of an assembly. So whether that be the House or the Senate or both of them together. So in the United States, particularly in Congress, if you have some sort of meeting, like the State of the Union address, the State of the Union address is presented before members of the House and the Senate. So that's presented before what we call the Committee of the Whole. So it's all members of Congress together, which is significant because that doesn't happen very often. It's mainly just for a couple things there. And then treaty ratification and confirmation, role of the Senate. So the Senate has to ratify any treaty the U.S. enters into, and they obviously have to confirm members of the president's cabinet and the court. And then Congress must generate a budget that addresses both discretionary and mandatory spending. So remember those two terms. That was from late in the year. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has control over, such as spending for the military, spending for social programs, whatever the case may be. Mandatory spending is something that they don't have control over. They have to spend money on Social Security or Medicare or things that they've committed to. Paying interest on our national debt. We have to pay that. There's no alternative to that. So what we've seen that as our entitlement programs grow, like Social Security and Medicare, is that discretionary spending that we have control over gets less and less and less and less. So unless Congress increases taxes, which we know they don't like to do, that can really lower discretionary spending. It also talks about pork barrel legislation and log rolling. Pork barrel, obviously, the things that we tack on to bills to get people to vote for them. Log rolling is that idea of I'll vote for your bill if you vote for my bill, kind of trading votes there. It's kind of that quid pro quo relationship of you do this for me and I'll do that for you. And it kind of explains how a lot of things get done in Congress. 2.3 talks about congressional behavior. And we know that when we have divided government, that it makes it really hard for things to get done. So it says congressional behavior and effectiveness are influenced by ideological divisions within Congress that can lead to gridlock or create the need for negotiation and compromise. So we see that all the time. We basically have two political parties that don't like to get along with each other. So because of that, it's hard to get things accomplished. So unless there's something that has kind of universal consensus, it's going to be very hard to get that thing done. It forces the need for negotiation, compromise, which, again, politicians don't like to do. They like to have it be all one way or all the other. Gerrymandering, redistricting, unequal representation. Remember these three terms that we've talked about. So we've got reapportionment, redistricting, and gerrymandering. So reapportionment is what we do every time we have a census. We count the number of people that are in each state. That determines how many votes in the House that state gets. It determines how many electoral votes that state gets. The process of counting who lives where and assigning seats is called reapportionment. Now, when we actually go to draw the lines to make sure that in Ohio, every one of our districts has the same number of people in it, that is redistricting. So if we're just drawing the lines just so each one's the same, that's redistricting. If we're drawing those lines such that we have a advantage for one party or the other, then that's gerrymandering. So please make sure you use those terms correctly. Don't just refer blindly to the process of drawing the lines as gerrymandering. Oftentimes it is, but it isn't by definition. It can be that process is not exactly the right term for that. The two Supreme Court cases we looked at related to this, Baker v. Carr, which was the one man, one vote idea, which basically says every district has to have the same number of people in it, and the Supreme Court can intervene there if that's not happening. And then Shaw v. Reno, which said that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. So those are the two big cases there. Divided government, we talked a lot about that. So divided government is when one party controls the House, one party controls the Senate, or one party controls all of Congress, but the other party controls the presidency, such that it's hard to override a presidential veto. So when you have divided government, it makes it harder for things to get done. Talks about lame duck presidents of the opposing party. That was key under the Obama administration. We had an opening on the Supreme Court 11 months before Barack Obama left office. And when that appointment came open, Congress basically said, you're a lame duck. You're out of here in a year. We're not going to let you put anybody on the Supreme Court. We're going to let the next president pick who that is. Now, because Republicans control the Senate today, if a member of the Supreme Court died today, even though Trump has 6 months left in his first term, I guarantee you they would try to fill that seat, even though 4 years ago they didn't do that. But that was because there was a Democrat as president. So it's something where the parties use those powers that they have as a significant kind of bargaining chip. Talks about different role conceptions here. It talks about the trustee model versus the delegate model, and we talked a little bit more about that. Politico, you don't really need to worry about. But trustee model is basically where the person says that the people have entrusted me with making decisions for them, so I'm going to basically make decisions that are in the best interest of my people. A delegate model basically says that I am the power, the citizens of my district have delegated that power to me. So sometimes I'm not going to ask them what they want. I'm just going to do what I believe is best for that district, and we'll kind of do what we need to get done there. So in terms of constituent service, if you remember, the term constituent service refers to anything that members of Congress do to kind of please their citizens in order to get them reelected. 2.4 talks about the role of the president. So we're getting into presidential powers now. Make sure you know the big things that the president can do. So obviously vetoes and pocket vetoes. If the president vetoes a bill, it takes a 2/3 vote of Congress to overturn that, so that doesn't happen very often. Pocket vetoes obviously happen within the last 10 days of a congressional session. Congress sends a bill to the president within those last 10 days. If the president doesn't sign it and doesn't veto it, that bill is dead if it doesn't get a signature on it. So we call that a pocket veto. The president has a lot of control over foreign policy, both formal powers, such as being the person who signs treaties. Now, Congress has to ratify those, and being the commander of the chief of the military, as well as informal powers. So the president can enter into executive agreements all the time that influence our relationship with other countries. The president also has what we call the bully pulpit. We talked about that. So it mentions here bargaining and persuasion, kind of an informal power the president has to get Congress to do something. So the president is always covered by the media every time he speaks. So that's a power that the president has to kind of influence Congress or the American people. Executive orders the president can do. And again, this is not in the Constitution, but we know that the president has the ability to enforce the law. So oftentimes executive orders are issuing guidance for how he wants laws to be interpreted or enforced. And then a signing statement. If you remember that, a signing statement basically is something informal in which when the president signs the bill, he tells the members of the bureaucracy, here's how I would like this carried out. So if Congress isn't super specific about how they want things carried out, the president can kind of influence members of members of the bureaucracy as to how they want that bill carried out after they sign it. So that would be a signing statement there. Checks on the president. Obviously, there are many. So when we look at particularly the Senate's relationship with the president, the Senate has to approve all ambassadors, all Supreme Court justices that are appointed by the president. So the Senate has considerable power to check the president. Obviously, the court has power to check the president in that they can declare executive orders unconstitutional. They can declare executive actions in terms of how things are enforced by the bureaucracy as unconstitutional. So those are all significant there. Obviously, the Senate confirmation process is an important check because a lot of the president's appointments, particularly judicial appointments, are lifelong appointments. So that's something that the Senate takes that role very seriously. But sometimes the president can be at odds with what Congress wants, and executive orders in particular may kind of run counter to what Congress wants to see accomplished. So that's something that they oftentimes try to pull back on the president. You're seeing that now with Congress holding hearings now on the coronavirus response. Presidents saying we're having no trouble with supplies, all that's great. And then you have some of his doctors saying the opposite. So now Congress is kind of stepping in to kind of perform an oversight role there. 2.6 talks about expansion of presidential power. Obviously, the key document here is Federalist 70. Federalist 70 talked about why a single executive is good, and that's what you looked at for the second to last assignment that we did in here. Why a single executive is better. Remember, there was the concern that what if we're attacked and we have multiple executives? Who ultimately gets to make the decision? So we fell back upon this idea of a single executive being best, even though there was this fear of a monarchy. We still kind of fell back on that idea because we had significant checks on the president. Obviously, the amendments that we have here, the 22nd Amendment, which sets presidential term limits, was significant, as well as the 25th Amendment, which requires the president to always have kind of the line of succession. What happens if the president's disabled for a period of time, or what happens if the president dies, vice president takes over. Now they have to name a new vice president. So that didn't used to be the case. So we've kind of amended the Constitution to fix some of the problems that we've seen as things have changed over time. Different perspectives on the presidential role continue to be debated in the context of contemporary events. So we look at kind of what role the president should have in society, what role they do have. Every time a president does anything that kind of is questionable in terms of overstepping their bounds, the other party will freak out about that. Obviously, Democrats are freaking out now about some things Trump has done, the same way that Republicans were freaking out about things that Obama did. So that's very, very common kind of in the modern political climate that we have in terms of that. Presidential communication. Obviously, the president has the ability, because the media covers him regularly, to always get his message out to the American people. We've had some of these really significant presidential addresses, whether it be FDR's speeches, fireside chats during the Great Depression, whether this was John F. Kennedy and his Put a Man on the Moon speech, whether this is Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address in which he warned about the military-industrial complex. We've had these really important presidential addresses that have been significant in American history. Today, things are a little bit different. Today, presidents through social media can communicate with people directly, as opposed to having to wait to either have the media cover them in some way or to have to give these big speeches. The president can communicate with you directly today, and that's obviously very different. The president also kind of sets the yearly agenda for things that he wants done, and he does that at his State of the Union address. It's a chance for the president to kind of lay out what their agenda is for the year. Now, Congress doesn't have to follow it, but the president will often kind of use that to lay that agenda out. Judicial branch. Big thing with the judicial branch was Federalist 78, which most of you did for that assignment that was due this week. Federalist 78 looked at the power of the judicial branch and kind of the independence that it exerts on the other branches through the checks and balances system. So the fact that the judicial branch does not have to run for re-election, they're appointed for life, they don't have to worry about any of that stuff, allows them to act independently and to not worry about public opinion and to not worry about what a political party may think. Now, we know that these judges tend to be ideological and that conservative justices tend to do what Republicans want and liberal justices tend to do what Democrats want, but they don't have to. And there's nothing they can do to kind of be penalized if they don't act certain ways, because they're there for life. As long as they don't commit a crime, then they're there forever. So it's one of those things that the independence of the judicial branch is very different from the other branches. So obviously Article 3 covers the judicial branch. I forgot to mention Article 2 covers the executive branch. Obviously, Federal 78 is a required document if they're asking you about the judicial branch. And then Marbury versus Madison is your big case, which really laid out what powers the judicial branch had. And that was why John Marshall is considered such an influential Supreme Court justice, is that things were unclear. And he basically articulated what the power of his branch was. And he didn't do it in a way that really sought to expand their powers. If anything, he took away some of their powers by declaring the Judiciary Act unconstitutional and saying that we don't have the powers to do these other things. So the judicial branch, key thing to remember is that they are independent. They're very separate from the other branches, and that they don't have to worry about politics. Judicial review, in conjunction with a life tenure, can lead to a debate about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court's power. So a lot of people have a problem sometimes when the Supreme Court strikes something down. So let's just say, for instance, Supreme Court were to strike down a previous ruling. Let's say they decide tomorrow that McDonald versus Chicago was wrong and that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to the states, so the states can ban guns. There would obviously be people up in arms about that, and they'd be up in arms because you have this non-elected body making these decisions that affect everybody, the same way that if they overturned Roe v. Wade, you'd have the same debate. So it's one of those things that because the court has the power of judicial review, and they use that power, and then they have a life tenure, that leads some people to kind of question the legitimacy of the judicial branch. Now, when the framers designed the system, they did it in this way in order to make sure that you had a system in place that protected the independence of this branch. They didn't want them to be influenced by politics or factions or all of these other things that they were concerned about. Precedents and stare decisis, if you remember the term stare decisis, just means let the decision stand. So oftentimes the court will fall back on previous rulings that other courts have made, whether it be at a lower court level that's heard this case before as it worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Remember, we have a three-tiered system. So we have district courts, we have appellate courts, and we have the Supreme Court. Refer back to Chapter 16. There are certain cases, things that have to do with ambassadors, suits between states that go straight to the Supreme Court. But a lot of things, most other cases have to work their way through the system from district to appellate to Supreme. And they kind of work their way up there. Obviously, the court flips. Ideological changes based upon who the president is. We talked significantly about the Warren Court. The Warren Court during the 1960s was very, very liberal. The Rehnquist Court, which was there starting in the late 80s and into the 90s and 2000s, that was much more conservative. And that's where we started to see some of these cases like U.S. v. Lopez that kind of backtracked and said things were state powers as opposed to being federal powers. Now remember, one big thing that you could be asked about here are different views of things based upon conservative or liberal. So liberal politicians, justices tend to be more activist, tend to read the Constitution in modern times, and tend to promote federal involvement in things. Conservative justices tend to be restraint judges, or that term we used before, judicial restraint, tend to think that states should have more power. Things should be handled at the state level as opposed to the federal level. So that's a key difference there. So, but the court flips back and forth based upon cycles of presidents. But as we've seen, there has not been one political party that has held the White House for more than 12 consecutive years, all the way back to Harry Truman. So we've gone for many, many years where it's been one, maybe two presidents from the same party, and then we flip back the other way. So we tend to see a court that's fairly balanced, 5-4 in one direction or the other, because of the fact that the presidents who appoint the justices flip. When the court's in action, we talked about, it talks here about decisions that can be addressed by future courts. Obviously, no court decision is really final. Any court decision can be reviewed by future courts. They have that ability to do that. The last page, I forgot to mention this, it mentioned off to the side over in this section over here, is it talked about the case of U.S. versus Nixon, and that was where the court really put a serious check on the executive branch in terms of executive orders and or executive action, what the president can do to kind of protect themselves. So remember, we had that series of cases where U.S. v. Nixon said that the president can't conceal information that might accuse him of a crime. Clinton v. Jones case said that the president can be sued for things that they did before they took office. Now, you can't be sued for things you do while you're in office. That was the Nixon versus Fitzgerald case. But if you're being sued for something you did before you came into office, that's fair game. And if you've committed a crime while you're in office, that's also fair game. They can get you for that. So the president is not immune, and the court oftentimes has to be the one to step in and make those decisions about those appointments and how that process works. Checks on the judicial branch. Now, we oftentimes assume that there's nothing that can be done to check the judicial branch. Obviously, the president can check Congress by vetoing things. Congress can check the president by having to approve all of their appointments. They can also check the president by overriding a presidential veto. Well, you can't override a judicial decision. The president can't fire a Supreme Court justice. Now, what can you do if you don't like what Congress has done? Well, obviously, you can amend the Constitution. If Congress says if the courts say that something's unconstitutional, you can just simply change the Constitution and make it so that it's no longer unconstitutional. So this is where you get into this big debate about, and that's really never happened except for when the court struck down the right of 18-year-olds to be able to vote, because Congress tried to pass a law saying that 18-year-olds should be able to vote. The court struck that down as unconstitutional, so then they amended the Constitution. So it doesn't happen that often where that occurs, but it can. That can be a check that the other branches have there. Obviously, Congress has the power to control the jurisdiction of the court. They control how many courts there are. They also control how many justices sit on the court. So when you look at FDR's court packing plan, that would have been a potential check that they had over things. Now, remember, we also talked about the fact that if the courts never heard a case on a particular topic, Congress can say that they're not allowed to hear that case, that they can limit the jurisdiction of the court. That's something that Congress can do. That's a check. So the checks that other branches, whether it be the president or the courts, have over, the president or Congress have over the courts, are a lot less known, really, than the checks that the court has over the two of them. Everybody really knows what the court can do, but they don't as much know what the other branches can do. Now, over here, it talks about some examples. These are all things that you are not required. They're not going to ask you specifically about them, but you can definitely use them, and you should know them. The Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg County case dealt with that issue of de facto versus de jure segregation as it related to busing and as to what states had to do. And remember that when we have de jure segregation, that's segregation by law, where people tend to discriminate or tend to isolate themselves based upon demographics. De jure is by law, where people where the law treats people differently by law. De facto is where people isolate themselves based upon where people may choose to live, settlements, things like that. Now, de jure segregation or de jure discrimination has always been illegal, and that's something that since we've really had the Civil Rights Act in place, that's been illegal. But de facto is not something that historically government has had to address. Now, with the Swan case, they said that you did have to address that. You had to bus people in order to balance out these school districts. Now, again, like I said, the courts change their mind all the time, and they have since backtracked on that. We no longer have to do that, but for a while we did. And that was something where the courts have kind of changed their mind based upon different periods in American history as to what they rule. Now, that Swan case came down right after the Warren Court. It was during the Burger Court, and that was still a fairly liberal court, not as liberal as the Warren Court, but they were significant in terms of expanding federal power and the ability of the federal government to provide oversight on different things. Bureaucracy, we're probably going to spend the least time on here because we just did this chapter a few weeks ago. Make sure you know that the bureaucracy are part of the executive branch. They're the people who carry out the law, so they're responsible here. You can see this for writing and enforcing regulations. The EPA can fine you if you do something wrong, things like that. They issue fines. They have to testify before Congress on various issues related to the role of the executive branch, and they're part of issue networks and iron triangles. So if you remember, iron triangles was this idea of an interest group, Congress, and the bureaucracy in terms of the interaction between those groups. Issue networks is when we bring in people like the media and think tanks and colleges and universities, people like that, and they debate issues and they figure out how they're going to address different topics. And it kind of shows you the interplay between those different groups that we have. Now, it kind of brings in here these ideas we talked about before. Patronage was something that kind of went away after the assassination of President Garfield. This was something that for a long time you were awarded positions not based upon your skill, but based upon who you knew or how much money you donated. We changed that with civil service reform. It was the Pendleton Act, which it mentions up here. Pendleton Act changed the way we set up our bureaucracy. So now it's much more professional in nature. People keep their jobs based upon their skill, not based upon who they know. And today we have a merit system. So you get promoted based upon your ability and not based upon, again, who you know and how much money you may give to your party. So the whole idea here is to promote professionalism, specialization in terms of positions, and neutrality. That's really what they were shooting for here. Discretionary authority, rulemaking authority. We talked about discretionary authority. It's when the bureaucracy is left to decide how they're going to carry out laws themselves. So Congress may say, okay, we task this agency with performing this function, but they don't tell them exactly how they want it performed. They leave that up to them. Well, that's discretionary authority. That's the ability of that agency to kind of do what they want based upon lack of oversight given to it by Congress. Now, every agency does these things differently. They all have kind of different ways in which they go about doing that. But discretionary authority, just make sure you're familiar with that term. And it's a way that the bureaucracy has power, and it's a way that the executive branch has power. Now, how do you hold them accountable? Obviously, Congress can hold them accountable through what's known as the power of the purse. And I use this term a couple times during the year, but I want to make sure you know what this means, just in case they drop this on the AP test. Congress controls the budget. So ultimately, if your agency isn't doing what Congress wants, they can cut your budget. So even though Congress's relationship with the executive branch is unique, and they have to kind of get along with the president, they also have to get along with the people who are carrying out the legislation. So, and if they don't get along with those people, they can just decide to cut that agency's budget, kind of change things around there. Those bureaucrats also have to appear before congressional committees. We're seeing that now. Members of the coronavirus task force are being called before congressional committees right now to answer for some of the things we're seeing at the federal level. Down here at the bottom, it says explain. Make sure students can explain how the president ensures that agencies and departments carry out the responsibilities with the goals of the administration. Now remember, the president appoints the secretaries, the heads of all of these agencies, but they don't appoint the people who work there, and those people carry over from administration to administration. So we talked about the fact that oftentimes those people will try to screw over their boss if their boss is trying to make them do things that they don't want to do. So the president has to try to do things to win these people over. And again, remember, it's very hard to fire a bureaucrat. So you have to kind of work around the system that you have in place. So sometimes it's hard. And sometimes these agencies will fight back if you have a president who's asking them to do something that they don't believe that they should do. And then finally, policy in the branches of the government. Students should know the extent to which government branches can hold the bureaucracy accountable, given the competing interests of Congress, the president, and the courts. Oftentimes, you're going to have Congress telling the bureaucracy to do one thing, the president may be telling them to do something else, and the court may say, well, both of those are unconstitutional. So again, you have the other branches, the bureaucracy is almost like this chip in the middle, where all of these other branches are fighting for who gets to control it. Ultimately, the president oversees the bureaucracy, but because Congress gets to pass the laws and control the budget, oftentimes Congress ends up having way more power over the bureaucracy than maybe they were even intended to. Because, again, a lot of the bureaucracy is not spelled out in the Constitution. We talk about that the executive branch will have the power to enforce the laws, but we don't say through cabinet departments or through any of these other things. We don't lay that out. So none of that's there. So it allows these other branches to kind of change their strategies as to how they go about influencing that unit. Okay, so that's topic 2. Now, obviously, I did not go through a lot of the things that you need to know. So back in the judicial branch chapter, please read through chapter 16 as it relates to the courts. Make sure you know what those terms are. So when we're talking about the process of getting a case to the Supreme Court, writs of certiorari. So we talked about 4 justices have to agree to hear a case. All of those terms there, please make sure you know those terms. Those are things that they could easily ask you on the AP test, particularly if they give you anything related to a court case, and you're going to need to know those terms. If you're having to stop and look every single one of those up, you're never going to finish in time in terms of the questions. So please make sure you review those terms and that you know those things going into the AP test. Okay, tomorrow I'll do topic 3. Monday from 12 to 3, the 3 hours right before your test, which you need to log on at 3:30 for your test on Monday. From 12 to 3, I will be at school. I'll be doing a Google Meet in my classroom. So if you have any things, jump online that day. I'll be at school. I can answer some questions. I'll have my whiteboard there. I can kind of draw things out if you need me to. But that'll be 12 to 3 on Monday. I'll be up there before your test. So please make sure you spend some time going over this stuff. Very, very important to study. I'm not as much worried about those of you who have been watching the videos as I am the people who haven't been watching the videos. So please spread the word to your friends to please make sure that they are reviewing. Hope everybody has a great day, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.